Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History podcast. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcast from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK history, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is Neil Chatelain. Welcome, Neil.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Okay, so could you first, Neil, before we actually get into our subject today, which is the Shenandoah, we're going to talk about that famous Confederate vessel. Could you tell us, or start by telling us how you first became interested in history, particularly the naval side of things?
So I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana, and it's the place where a lot of Confederate leadership based essentially retired in because the city wasn't destroyed during the Civil War. It didn't require rebuilding, and so the city is just surrounded by this Civil War history and culture, and there's statues everywhere, or there used to be, and there's graves of all these top generals and everything. So like I was just sort of brought up in this place where the Civil War is important to look at. And so as a kid, I just grew up doing that. And since it's on the Mississippi River, elements of the naval part of the war were always there. Forts were there. People were always talking about ships, that sort of a thing. So I was always studying the Civil War as a kid, as a teenager. And when I was doing my undergraduate work at university, that's when I started shifting to studying the naval aspects of the war. That's when that started to really interest me. And so I've kind of been doing that ever since. It's been really fun.
And you was also in the Navy as well, I take it?
Yeah, I was. So I spent 9 years in the U.S. Navy. I served on guided missile frigates and amphibious transports and some shore assignments and stuff like that. So it was
Okay,
pretty good.
so that bug really bit you with the naval side of things, and it sort of never left you. That's cool.
Apparently.
Okay, so let's talk about the Shenandoah then. So, very famous vessel, the CSS, I should say, Shenandoah. How did it come to serve the Confederacy during the American Civil War in the first place? And did it have a previous life?
Yeah, so unlike other commerce raiders that the Confederacy got in Britain, Shenandoah was already built. It was not a purpose-built commerce raider. So its original name was Sea King. It was built in Glasgow and operated as a essentially a ship that was supposed to transport people and goods to Asia. Essentially, what we're calling it is a modified T-clipper to an extent. And so it actually made a trip to New Zealand, dropping off British soldiers to New Zealand to fight over there. And then on its way back, so that's kind of a big deal because that proves that the ship can make a transoceanic journey, a lengthy journey, sort of a thing. And so that's sort of why it was noted as a potential ship to be used, is because it had already proven it can go across the ocean, and it had already proven its durability for extended voyages. So that's when the Confederates in Liverpool, essentially, and in London tried to acquire the vessel, and they were able to clandestinely acquire the vessel. And that's primarily due to the work of Commander James Bullock, the same guy who made contracts for the layered rams and who made contracts for what became Alabama and Florida from the Birkenhead yards and everything like that in Liverpool.
hmm I believe he was involved in the cotton trade as well, wasn't he, Bullock?
Yeah, I mean, it's all integrated together. So, like, the
hmm
Confederate primary financiers in Europe were the Fraser, Trenholm and Company, which is the British element of the firm John Fraser and Company over in South Carolina. And so they were involved in smuggling, they were involved in transportation of cotton. So it's all kind of linked together in this network of diplomatic international activity that the Confederate government tried to sustain to an extent.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Okay, so why did the Confederacy again invest more in these commerce raiders like the Shenandoah instead of building the traditional navy?
Yeah, so the word traditional there is actually pretty interesting. I would argue this is the traditional Navy in some respects, in that it's not like what you might expect. Like it's not an ironclad vessel, and it's not a ship that's designed to attack enemy warships, but this commerce raiding aspect was always sort of present in warfare for the last several hundred years. I mean, going all the way back to the English and all their adventurers trying to take over Spanish treasure ships and things like that. So this commerce raiding strategy is it's a legitimate strategy. It was used by the English during in the 1500s. It was used by the French and the British, both in the Napoleonic conflicts. It was used by the United States in the Revolution, our War for Independence. It was used by the United States in the War of 1812. Essentially, what the idea is that a weaker naval power, so the one that has fewer ships and fewer and little strength, their goal is to attack enemy merchant ships and drive enemy commerce from the seas, either through capturing it directly or forcing them to halt trade altogether for fear of that capture. And so the concept there is that the Confederates have fewer ships, and so they're going to send some of their ships out onto the ocean, capture U.S. merchants, and then use those captures to drive U.S. commerce from the seas. That's going to hurt the U.S. economy. That's going to drive U.S. business leaders, essentially the oligarchs in New York, to no longer want to support the war effort because their profits are being cut into, sort of a thing. And so that's the Confederacy's goal with these commerce raiders. They have more traditional warships, of course, but Shenandoah is not one of those traditional line of battle ships or ironclads or frigates or something like that. It's designed for the Confederacy. Its purpose is to go out, hunt these merchant ships, and for Shenandoah specifically, it's whaling ships is its target, which we can talk about in a minute. And so that's sort of the goal here is drive enemy U.S. commerce from the sea.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Okay, let's talk about the crew for a minute, and its commander. Um, so Commander James Waddell, is that how you pronounce that?
Yeah. hmm
Waddell. Yeah, so let's talk about the crew. What kind of nationalities were they, and what walks of life were they from?
Yeah. So Waddell and his senior officers, they're all from the Confederacy. They've all spent time in Confederate service on other ships. So Waddell actually served trying to build ironclads on the Mississippi River before he eventually made his way to Europe. Some of his other officers, for the most part, they're all from the Confederacy. Some of the junior officers, however, are not from the Confederacy. They're from the UK. So some of the officers, one's from England, one's from Scotland, one's from Ireland, one's from maybe another one from England. I'm trying to remember the full extent, but so most of the senior officers, Confederate born, or not born, but Confederate or government from the Confederacy, from the American South. Some junior officers from the UK. Common sailors is a very different story, though. The ship was acquired in London. The ship was outfitted as a Confederate warship in the Madeira Islands. The ship never entered a Confederate port, and the only other ports that it even entered at this point was a French island in the Indian Ocean, Australia, some Pacific islands that were essentially unclaimed and left by local occupants, so not claimed by any empires at that point. So they're not getting crew from the Confederacy. So most of the crew, it's either they're from the British Isles because they signed onto the ship originally in a clandestine matter. They're from Australia. A large number of people, when the ship was docked in Melbourne, a large number of people stowed away in secret, or at least that's what they say, and signed on as part of the crew immediately. There are a couple of Pacific Islanders on the ship that joined the crew, either from captures or from when they stopped at some of these Pacific islands to resupply. There's some Americans on the ship, and those are primarily Americans that are on the ship essentially because they volunteered after the ships that they were on, the merchant ships that they were on, were captured, and they were given the option, hey, do you want to sign on? And they said yes. And there's even several Black Americans on the ship, at least four that we know of, four Black men that were on the ship. Their enlistment, they actually signed articles of enlistment on the vessel, in the logbooks and everything like that. But their jobs and their status on the ship is a little hazy. We know one of those black men was a servant, essentially an enslaved man to another crew member. And then we know at least one of them really didn't sign on by choice. He signed on essentially because he was being triced up, which is being held by your thumbs, tied up, and forced to stand on your toes and sort of a thing. And he was essentially told, "Hey, sign up, or we're just going to leave you like this until you sign onto the ship." And he signed onto the ship, but once the ship got to Australia, he deserted and went to the U.S. government there, the U.S. consul there, along with some other people. So it's kind of a motley crew. You've got British subjects, you've got Americans, you've got black men, you've got Pacific Islanders, you've got Australians. It's sort of a very cosmopolitan group, you could say. Kind of unexpected when you think of Civil War vessels, I suppose.
Yeah, and again, with its size, it wouldn't have been able to go to a US port anyway, would it? Because of the blockade. So that would have been a problem.
Yeah, the blockade was, I mean, the Shenandoah was out by October 1864. The U.S. blockade is pretty solidified. And the ports in the Confederacy that it could even get to at that point are Galveston in Texas, Wilmington in North Carolina. And by the time it makes the transatlantic journey, there's 100 ships at Wilmington, North Carolina, blockading it to prepare for assault. So, like, options are limited, even if it wanted to get to the Confederacy. But that wasn't its intended mission, so that's not even something that was in their minds.
hmm And I like to the point about the coloured guys on board, because obviously at that point, that was the only part of the war where soldiers, or sorry, sailors were not segregated, were they? So you see that within the Union Army or the Union Navy as well, don't you?
Yeah. Both the United States Navy and the Confederate States Navy, their regulations allowed the enlistment of black sailors. Um, the United States Navy, we have records for about 18,000 black men who served in the U.S. Navy during the Civil War, which is statistically maybe 1 in 5 sailors during the Civil War for the U.S. Navy. The Confederate Navy, I've been doing a lot of research into black men who may have been in the Confederate Navy as regularly enlisted men. Um, I've come up with about 80 names, and most of those names are people who were enslaved and forced to be on the ship, or people who were captured and then forced to be on a ship, um, or issues like that. I've even found a couple of instances of U.S. Navy sailors who were captured in battle and then basically forced to be on a Confederate warship. So I would say maybe 40 or so black men who volunteered on a more voluntary of a more voluntary basis to be on a Confederate warship, and even that's a little hazy. So I'm still in the early stages of a whole big research project on just that. But you're right. These men on both the U.S. and Confederate Navy, they served on warships. You can't really segregate a warship to an extent, and so they served in a more integrated capacity. That doesn't mean that they were treated as equals, so to speak. A lot of times it was more. Black sailors are relegated to other sorts of jobs, other types of work. Promotions come less often, that sort of a thing. But it's not like the armies where the U.S. Army, they have segregated military units known as the U.S. Colored Troops, the U.S. Colored Infantry and whatnot. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a different aspect, and that comes because the U.S. Navy allowed black sailors to enlist in the U.S. Navy even before the Civil War and serve in that same capacity.
hmm Okay, let's talk about what life and daily life is like for sailors aboard not just the Shenandoah, but these ships that are out at sea for months and months on end, and cramped conditions. And what is life like on these ships?
Yeah, so daily life on any warship then and today is divided into a rigorous daily schedule. Today we call it the plan of the day in the U.S. Navy. But essentially it's just what's the daily routine, and it's always essentially the same thing. So there's reveille, there's a set schedule for when everybody does things. So typically sailors wake up, then they clean the ship, and then they perform early tasks, cleanliness, fixing things, maintenance, that sort of a thing. At some point during the day, they'll run drills to train. Either it's on guns, or it's on small arms, or it's on boarding, or something like that. Sometimes they'll do maneuvering drills where they're operating engines or maneuvering sails to train people on how to do those things. Um, The evenings are typically a little bit more free structured in that sailors have some time to write letters, not that they're going to be able to send them anytime soon, or to sing, play music, that sort of a thing. Um, that's kind of a daily routine. It's sort of like that every day. Now, also in that is a subroutine called the system of standing watches on a vessel. So each area of the ship is divided up, and each crew member is assigned to a certain watch station for daily operations. So, like, engineers are going to divide themselves up into a couple of different watch stations. So there's always somebody on guard in the engine room operating the vessel. And it's the same for the crew. So, like, officers will stand watch as officer of the deck, where they're in charge of the daily sailing and operation of the ship. Sailors are divided into watches so that there's always some sailors on watch at the wheel, on watch tending to the sails, that sort of a thing, so that just daily navigation of the vessel can occur. And then when an emergency happens, then they'll call everybody to either general quarters, action stations, whatever you want to call it, and that's when everybody will man their battle stations to fight in a sort of respect if that were to happen. But this daily routine is really ingrained in everybody, so that sailors are very used to knowing exactly what they're supposed to be doing every day. And that's sort of how sailors survive at sea, is knowing that there's this routine, they stick to it, they know what's expected of them, and that way there's less unknown, because I mean there's a lot of unknowns when you're out on the ocean and there's nobody around you and you don't really know when the next time you're going to hit a port. A lot of sailors don't even know where they're going, so to speak. They might have a general idea, but they're not knowing exactly what port the captain is sailing towards or something like that. So this daily routine is critically important for making sure that morale is maintained, and for making sure that everybody's doing their jobs. But it's also sort of a security thing too. Like, if sailors know their daily routine, then it's easy to spot when something's off. And so that helps officers and the leadership understand that if there's a problem, they need to attend to.
Hmm. And again, the Shenandoah has some really long journeys and voyages, doesn't it, around very remote parts of the world. So how do they handle that as well? Like you said, then sometimes don't even know where they're going, you know. That must be, mentally, draining for them sometimes, not knowing where you're going.
I've been in that situation myself, and it's very interesting to see crew members just sitting there going like, I don't even know where we are. I don't even know where we're going. So, and that's in the age of satellites, and that's in the age of, digital charts and all that sort of a thing. So even today, common sailors, a lot of them are just doing their jobs, and they're not told exactly what's happening because it's not their position to need to know those sorts of things all the time. At least in the real minutia of day to day. So like they understand where they are in the grand scheme, but the minutia, I mean, sometimes somebody in the engine room doesn't need to know exactly how many miles off the coast of Greenland they are at that point, so to speak.
Yeah, of course. Okay, were there any notable personalities, conflicts among the officers and the crew of the Shenandoah?
Yeah, so lots of officers on the ship. They got along pretty well. It wasn't sort of a worry between the officers, and that's a lot because they were selected for the vessel. It wasn't so much they just grabbed whoever they could. Officers for these voyages, officers for these commerce raiders, they were sent to Europe deliberately to be part of these crews. And so they sent officers from the Confederacy who they knew could handle such things, or who they knew, at least for junior officers, needed the experience to gain for such sustained voyages. And so it wasn't so much that the Confederacy said, "Oh, let's send the worst guys we have for this job." They chose their officers wisely. And I mean, like, look at the crew of CSS Alabama, who's in the photograph there. Those officers are some of the Confederacy's most well-known officers, and it's not because Alabama was famous. It was because they helped make Alabama famous, because they were the crew chosen for that job. There was some conflict, though, and a lot of that conflict was essentially between a couple of the enlisted sailors and the officers in some respects. And one of the big elements of that conflict was between one of the black sailors. So one of those black sailors, he did not want to be on the ship. He was forced to be on the ship. This is the ship's cook, and he was captured from a U.S. vessel, and he was brought onto the Confederate ship, and he essentially did not want to be there, and so he would start doing things to show his distaste of being on the vessel. His name is John Williams, and the Shenandoah's executive officer, the XO, the second in command, he very regularly in his diary and in the vessel's logbook is talking about having to punish John Williams for acting up, punish John Williams for talking back, punish John Williams for getting in a fight with another sailor. And so John Williams is sort of the officer corps' problem sailor in some respects, and it makes sense that he doesn't want to be on the vessel, and in fact, when the ship docks in Melbourne, he deserts, goes to the U.S. consul, and essentially says they kidnapped me and forced me to be here, and testified against the Confederate government in efforts to stop the ship from escaping and in efforts to hold the ship accountable later on. So there are some conflicts like that. The logbook has note of other conflicts, but it's not necessarily unexpected things. Other sailors would get into fights every now and then, and that's just when you don't know where you are and you don't know what's going on. Sometimes you just have a bad day and something will set you off, and then you just push somebody, or your food is not as good as the guy's food who's next to you, in the luck of the draw. So things like that happen a lot, but that's not like anything recurring that causes a trend, so to speak. That's just individual sailors at one time or another.
Yeah. Oh, and I just want to say they're very brave letting somebody that doesn't want to be on a ship cook their food for them. Could have ended badly. Oh, dear. Okay. Thanks, mate. Okay. So let's talk about the primary objectives of the Shenandoah and how successful was it at disrupting Union commerce?
Yeah, so Shenandoah had one mission, and it was a mission that James Bullock back in England had wanted to accomplish for some time. That primary mission was to intercept, disrupt, and destroy the U.S. whaling fleet in the Pacific Ocean. So that's an element of the U.S. merchant marine that had not been attacked at this point. So other Confederate commerce raiders had prowled the Atlantic Ocean, both in North and South America. They had gone into the Indian Ocean, and they had hunted in the waters of Europe. This whaling fleet represents the largest, it's not organized, but it's the largest collection of vessels that are still flying the U.S. flag that have essentially been untouched by this war. A couple of whaling vessels were captured in the Atlantic on their way to the Pacific, so to speak, but there are still dozens and dozens and dozens of American flagged whale ships operating in the Pacific Ocean, some of them for years and years at a time, several years at a time, these voyages can last. And so they're out there. And so Shenandoah's primary purpose is not to hunt in the Indian Ocean and not to hunt in off like the South China Sea or anything like that. Its goal is to go through all those areas, push past them, and get to the upper parts of the Pacific Ocean, north of Hawaii, and hunt between Hawaii and Alaska and take out these whaling vessels. And let's just say it does a really good job of that. Shenandoah captures 38 vessels during its career. That's the second largest number of vessels by just number alone, captured by a Confederate warship. The only one who captured more ships was Alabama, which captured 65 ships. So it was very successful, and essentially the New England whaling fleet was very crippled because of Shenandoah's activities, largely in Russian waters in the Sea of Okhotsk and Alaskan waters.
Hmm. And what was the whale used for back in that time? Because it was obviously that important that they decided to go after these whaling ships. What kind of so I think mostly oil, but did they use all of the whale?
So yeah, so oil is the primary thing. So like if you read In the Heart of the Sea or Moby Dick or something like that, they're hunting these whales so that they can get the whale oil, and that's powering lamps. I mean, that's where the gasoliers and the lamps are being used. This is before electricity is being used in homes or in businesses, and so the whale oil is critical to maintaining lights at night, essentially, or indoor lighting for homes and businesses. Besides that, they're using the fat of the whale, and that's to do everything from make medicines to making soap to doing other things like that. So it's not just they take the whale oil and then dump the carcass over the side. They're using significant amounts of different parts of the whale in different ways. It's just the oil part is the most profitable element of it, and is the part that everybody remembers because of books that have been written about hunting whales in the last 150 years.
So as time goes on, that really affects the supply chain of oil, and people are basically sitting in the dark in the north, are they? Because they're not getting you know, their oil. And
Yeah, there's a real element of if the Civil War had continued on, because I mean most of these ships were captured as the war was ending. If the Civil War would have continued on, there might have been some serious disruptions to the supply chain of um, sperm whale oil in North America, and that could have caused some significant problems with factory operations or
yes,
just
of course,
the
yeah.
wealthy being able to read in their parlors at night, sort of a thing. And so it would have made people upset in many different ways.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's something you don't think about when you relate the Civil War to things. Is that it's quite yeah, it's quite interesting. Okay, can you talk us through a typical engagement between the Shenandoah and its targets, please?
Yeah, so for these commerce raiders, it's very the actions are very similar over and over and over again. So a typical operation is they're going to have lookouts posted at all times. A lookout will sight a vessel on the horizon, and they'll head towards that vessel. They'll watch what that vessel looks like from a distance. Sometimes they're looking for if the vessel has a smokestack, can they see if there's smoke coming out of it? Because that could be a hint that it's a steamer, which could be a hint that it's an enemy warship. So they might want to avoid those. But they essentially see a ship on the horizon. They'll sail towards it. They'll activate their engines because for Shenandoah and for Alabama and Florida and all these other commerce raiders, they have engines, but those engines are auxiliary purposed engines, as in 99% of the time they're using their sails, and only about 1% to 5% of the time they're going to be using their engine because where you're going to get resupplied coal from, especially in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, it's not like you can just stop at a port and just get more coal. So their use of engine power is going to be very limited to just emergency maneuvering, or if they can't catch a ship chasing it. They'll chase a ship, they'll overhaul a target, and then signal to it to heave to stop. If they refuse to do that, then they'll start shooting blank rounds at it as a signal. Hey, you better stop before we really start shooting at you. There are some instances of vessels that Confederate commerce raiders they have to shoot live rounds over to get them to stop. And then eventually they'll stop. Every now and then, a merchant ship will give chase, as in try to escape. Every now and then, they're successful in escaping. But for the most part, if they see a ship, if the Confederate commerce raiders see a ship, chase it, they're going to overhaul it and stop it. And then they have to figure out if it's even a ship they can capture at that point, right? So like they're going to do that by studying what does the ship look like so that they can determine, oh, that's definitely a ship built in London, or oh, that's definitely a ship built in Liverpool, or oh, that's definitely a ship built in Boston. Then they'll send a prize crew over to the ship as a boarding party, board it, investigate the paperwork on the vessel, investigate its registry, examine the manifest, determine who owns the vessel, determine what flag the vessel is sailing under. And if they determine that it's a U.S. flagged vessel, they'll bring that information back to the skipper of the ship on the Confederate warship. So to Waddell in Shenandoah's case, he'll review all the documents and he'll determine whether or not the vessel's a prize or not. And when they determine it's a prize, they'll give the crew of the captured ship time to get off the ship. They'll bring them to the Confederate ship to Shenandoah or Alabama or whoever. They'll unload them to the Confederate ship as prisoners, and then they will sink the target at that point. Most of the time they do that through burning. They'll just set it on fire. Every now and then the Confederates will use a ship for target practice. That's pretty rare though, because where they're gonna get replacement ammunition. So that's not a very common thing. Every now and then, these commerce raiders, what they do instead is they bond a ship, which is they essentially hold the ship for ransom. They force the captain to sign a piece of paper that says, I promise at the end of the war, I'm going to pay the Confederate government, or the ship's owners are going to pay the Confederate government, the value of the ship and its cargo. And then they're going to let the ship go. And that's because the ship might be U.S. flagged, but it's carrying neutral goods. Or it might be a neutral ship, like a British flagged ship, but it's carrying U.S. goods. So they'll bond that ship. Or it could just be Shenandoah has a crew of 100 people and they have 80 prisoners on their ship. So they'll just bond a captured ship instead, load all the prisoners on it, and then release it so that they can get rid of all their prisoners. So, the typical interactions, it's usually this one-on-one situation. Shenandoah is a little different in some respects because many of its captures happen simultaneously. So like the picture here, you can see it's capturing multiple ships at the same time because all these whaling ships are hunting whales, and the whales are all moving in packs. And so all the ships are kind of together in the same location. And when they see one ship on fire, whale ships go to where that fire is so that they can help rescue people because they think a ship is in trouble. There's an accident that happened or something. And so ships just essentially show up, and then Shenandoah will capture multiple at a time. Let me check the numbers here. There's a couple of instances where Shenandoah captured multiple ships all at the same time. So like on June 28th, it captured a whole slew of ships, like 5, 6, 7, 8 of them, just in one day. And that's just because they're all in the same locality. So it's not always a one at a time situation. It could be multiple ships in one day, so to speak. But in general, commerce raiders are going to capture ships one at a time.
Yeah, it's really opened my eyes. Very interesting. I didn't know half of this stuff. It's really, really interesting. Yeah. So do some of these, whaling ships and that start maybe trying to arm themselves a bit better to protect themselves? And again, if the Shenandoah is quite a big ship, isn't it, compared to some of these whaling ships? But is there any instance like that?
So there are instances of some U.S. flagged merchant vessels or civilian vessels arming themselves. Not these whaling ships, though. They have they have guns, they have muskets, they have rifles, but they don't have 50 of them because the ship only has a typical whaling ship doesn't have a crew of 50 people, so they're not well armed, so to speak. And those muskets are basically there. To shoot birds when they're at a port and they want to, if they're at a random island and they need food, they're going to shoot some animals, or to shoot a whale if they can't harpoon it and they need a gun to, help kill a whale. They'll try to shoot it in the head or something like that. Not that that's going to do anything per se, but they like to have some weapons just in case. Other U.S. flagged vessels did arm themselves, but those are typically the vessels that are more valuable. So like the vessels that are operating between San Francisco and Panama, and then Panama and New York, the Atlantic and Pacific Mail Company and the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, those ships had cannons on them because those ships were transporting people from the East Coast to the West Coast, but they're also transporting gold from the West Coast to the East Coast. And those ships were well armed. CSS Alabama captured one of those ships one day and took one of its cannons from that ship and put it on CSS Alabama and used it in battle later. So like it was that some of these vessels were armed. Whale ships, they didn't have heavy artillery. They couldn't. The decks of the whale ships couldn't even support the weight of those guns. So they were just lightly armed. So it wasn't so much let's fight back situation. They knew that if they were caught, they were caught.
Very dangerous time to travel then if you're American at that point, or traveling, like you said, from the east to the west.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So the Shenandoah is obviously famous for sailing around the world. And how usual was that for a Civil War vessel? Because they really do get around, don't they?
Yeah, it's kind of weird, right? Like, Shenandoah is the only Confederate flagged ship to circumnavigate the globe. Now, did U.S. flagged ships circumnavigate the globe before this? Yes, of course. So in the antebellum U.S. Navy, a ship circumnavigating Earth was not uncommon. They would do that. Not every ship, but it did happen, and it happened enough times where it was kind of a routine operation for the U.S. Navy. During the Civil War, the number of ships circumnavigating the globe that are warships for either side drops drastically, and that's just because of the nature of the work that they're doing. So, like, the U.S. Navy is not sending ships to circumnavigate the globe because 90% of its ships are on the blockade or on the Mississippi River or something. So Of course, they're not going to be traveling globally. The ships that are traveling globally are these Confederate commerce raiders and the U.S. Navy warships that are being sent in these hunter-killer groups to track them and hunt them down. But even then, most of those are in the Caribbean and in European waters. There's a couple of instances of some U.S. warships that are in California being sent to China to hunt for Confederate raiders, sort of a thing. But the number of ships that are actually circumnavigating the globe as warships, either U.S. or Confederate flagged, during the war itself, it's relatively few, and Shenandoah is the only Confederate one. That's not because it's uncommon at the time; it's just because of the circumstances and the geography of the Civil War itself.
Yeah, excellent. And I've got to say, I've got to ask as well. So, how does they're out at sea for these long periods of time? How did they manage to, supply themselves with, a good supply lines and
Yeah,
keep themselves afloat?
so Confederate commerce raiders, most of them didn't have a supply line. In the traditional respect. Now, some Confederate commerce raiders actually did. So I'll use Alabama as the sort of famous case here. It had a regular supply line in the respect that there was a civilian Confederate flagged merchant ship that was British owned that would follow it around, and they met at regular rendezvous points. So that ship was called Agrippina, and it helped outfit Alabama. And then essentially, Alabama's officer said, "Okay, Agrippina, go back to England, resupply, meet us at this latitude and longitude during this, 2-week time span, and we will be there." And you will be there, and we will transfer supplies to us and recoal through you. And that happened several times under Alabama. So they kind of had a sort of quasi regular supply line to a respect, but that required a lot of coordination. Um, Other Confederate commerce raiders were outfitted from civilian ships. So, like Shenandoah was outfitted because it not in England, but in the Madeira Islands, and it was outfitted because a civilian ship that the Confederates had contracted for went to the Madeira Islands with a bunch of cannons and supplies, and then brought those to Shenandoah, and that was when it was just becoming a Confederate warship. But other than that, Shenandoah doesn't have a supply line. It's not going to get regular resupplies from anything else. Shenandoah's supplies come from two main avenues. One is when they make port somewhere, and that's very sparingly. They're going to make port at a couple of islands in the Indian Ocean. They're going to make port at Melbourne, and they're going to make port at a couple of islands in the Pacific Ocean, but they're not pulling into like Singapore or anything like that. It's not like they're just pulling into a place where there's a lot of docking situation. I mean, if you look at the map here, notice Shenandoah doesn't go to Cape Town. It stays clear of Cape Town because they're worried about being spotted and then word spreading. Hey, the Confederates are heading to the Indian Ocean. And it doesn't make port in South America at all. And that's because they're worried that the war is over and they're going to be put on trial and captured or something like that. So their resupplies come very sparingly through port visits. The other way that they're getting supplies is through their captured ships. So before they take and destroy a ship that they capture, they're going to survey that ship, take all the food, take all the navigational equipment, take the furniture that they want, even. Like there's accounts that people will, on these commerce raiders, they'll take a couch from captured ship and then move it into the captain's cabin or something like that. So they'll take whatever supplies they can. They'll take newspapers, any intelligence that they can get before they destroy these ships. And so essentially, Shenandoah is living off the spoils of its captures, and it's not getting supplies any other way, except for these very sparing port visits. So that's kind of tough because then it's, oh, we've only got 2 weeks worth of food. We need to capture something, or we're going to run out of food. So it's pretty tough to be a crew member knowing that the stockpile of food is getting smaller and you haven't sighted an enemy ship in a month. So what's going on? That's pretty tough to have to comprehend.
Hmm. And are there any incidents where they dock in Britain during the span of the war?
So Shenandoah's its journey starts in London and its journey ends in Liverpool. And besides that, the only other time that it docks is in a British, in a UK controlled environment is in Melbourne.
Hmm. Oh,
That's
cool.
it.
Excellent. Okay, so again, the Shenandoah continues attacking Union ships even after the Civil Wars come to its end. And obviously, when you're out at sea, you're not going to get that news. And obviously, we will talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But why do they continue to attack Union vessels after? Is it because they don't know that the war's ended?
Yeah, so like that's the hard part about Shenandoah's case is, what you're seeing in the painting there, it's happening in April 1865. And everybody knows that the Civil War is coming to its terminus at that point, right? Robert E. Lee is surrendering in April 1865. Joseph Johnston is surrendering in April 1865. But this brings up a huge point of when did the war end? When did the Civil War actually end? Um, so we've got these surrenders in April. We've got more Confederate surrenders in May in Alabama and Mississippi and in Texas and whatnot. Confederate armies in the Indian Territory, modern day Oklahoma, surrender in June. And President Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, he declares the rebellion over in August 1865. That's when he officially declares the war over. And that's essentially a technicality so they can stop paying soldiers hazard pay and, things like that so that it can shift to a more peacetime post-war role with that whole Reconstruction time period. So Shenandoah and the timeline of when does it actually know when the war is over, it falls in line with when that war is officially declared over by Andrew Johnson. So Shenandoah is hunting ships, the whaling ships, in April 1865. It first gets a report that Robert E. Lee has surrendered. That first report happens June 27th, 1865. And that report comes from a newspaper that they find on a ship that they capture. And essentially, the ship that they capture is using that newspaper as evidence, like, hey, look, the war is over. You guys don't need to capture us, that sort of a thing. And Waddell looks at the newspaper, and what he sees is the headline is Robert E. Lee surrenders Confederate army at Appomattox. But then right next to that is another news article that says President Jefferson Davis is on the run and vows to continue fighting the war. And then next to that is another news article that says, and Joseph Johnston is still fighting in North Carolina. And so what does Waddell think? Okay, one Confederate army surrendered, but the rest of the Confederacy is still fighting. And so he condemns that ship. He takes that ship as a prize and whatnot, and he continues on his journey.
Oh, interesting.
That being said, a couple weeks later, August 3rd, he encounters a British ship. And that British ship has another newspaper. And so this is a neutral ship. It's a third party, right? And that British ship has another newspaper, and the crew of that ship essentially tell Waddell and the Shenandoah's sailors, yeah, Jefferson Davis has been captured, the Confederate government's dissolved, there's nothing left. And so it's not until August 3rd, 1865 that the Confederates on this ship admit to themselves, essentially, okay, the war is over. And at that point, they're off the coast of, like, Mexico, sailing south, and the Pacific coastline of Mexico. And so they make the decision, okay, we're gonna give up. But they don't want to surrender to the United States. And that's because they're worried that a ship surrendering 4 months, 5 months, 6 months after Appomattox and after Lincoln is assassinated, they're going to be held accountable for that. They're going to be declared pirates, sort of a thing, because they're a stateless ship at this point. And so what they do is they disarm themselves, they take all their guns, they put them in their hold, and then they make the decision that they're going to go to England and they're going to go surrender, and they ultimately move to Liverpool. And that's the idea there is if we surrender to the British, they won't put us on trial for treason. They won't pull us on trial for piracy. And a lot of the crew are British subjects, and so those folks will be safe. And we have contacts in Liverpool, James Bullock and this Fraser Trenholm and Company. They're all headquartered there. And so we have money there. And so we'll have contacts there. And so that's kind of the decision they make is let's go to Liverpool and surrender there, which means they have to go around South America and then navigate and avoid any contact with any ship on the way. So they deliberately avoid running into other ships at that point. They don't sight another ship until they reach England. And they do that on purpose so that nobody can see them and go, hey, isn't that those Confederate guys? We should report them.
Yeah. Oh, excellent. That's fantastic. Okay, so again, like you said, they do surrender in Liverpool docks on November the 6th, 1865. Talk us through that event and what actually takes place during that surrender.
Yeah, so as they come to dock in Liverpool, it's the last time they raise the Confederate flag, and it's very interesting because the pilot that's navigating them into the wharves and the docks there, he's kind of surprised that it's a Confederate ship. He's like, "Oh, this is the famous ship, nice." So he's kind of starstruck by it. Um, they dock the ship. Waddell talks to some Royal Navy officials in Liverpool, announces what his plan is. And then the building that you're seeing there is where he officially hands over the documentation for the ship to the British government. And that's sort of seen as the last surrender, is the official surrendering of the ship is when he turns it over the jurisdiction of the vessel to the British authorities at the government building pictured there. After that, the British they have questions about it. They have to determine what to do. They transfer the ship to the United States. They give it to the U.S. government in England, and then we can talk about what happens to the ship afterwards later. But then the British have to determine what happens to the crew as well, and essentially they're in a bind because, like I said, most of the crew are British subjects, and so are they going to punish their own guys? So the British government very quickly makes an announcement that Shenandoah's crew is free to go, and they didn't violate any international laws, and we swear it, and they didn't violate British neutrality laws, we promise, and so they're all just kind of released on their own recognizance at that point. Waddell pays everybody off with the funds that he has left, and everybody just kind of goes their separate ways at that point.
That's really cool. Yeah. And can we claim that the Civil War finished in England?
That's what, so navalists like me, we always like to point out that this is the last surrender.
Hmm.
Um, Whether that counts as the war ended at that building right there, that's kind of a hit and miss sort of a thing. But
Yeah, I
like
get you. Yeah.
this is the last actual
The
organized
last
surrender of
surrender, it's
Confederate
not the end of the
forces.
war. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like that's it's kind of weird. Like, would you say World War II ended in the 1960s when they found that one Japanese guy in the
Yeah, I
Philippines?
get you.
Like,
I
that's
get
not
you.
necessarily the case,
Yeah.
and that's an extreme example. But like, this is absolutely the last organized surrender of uniformed Confederates
Hmm.
ever. And that's kind of a huge distinction. And the fact that it occurs in Liverpool, the fact that it occurs with a warship, it kind of really highlights the global scale and the
Hmm.
international aspects of this war that we can talk about the ramification of later on.
Hmm. Okay, like you said, you pointed out and you said you would mention what happened to the Shenandoah after it surrenders in Liverpool. So what does happen to the ship?
Yeah, so I want to talk about the ship and I want to talk about what happens to the crew. We'll do the ship first, I guess. So Shenandoah is turned over to the British authorities. They turn it over to the U.S. government, and then the U.S. government sells the ship kind of essentially at auction to recoup some money. They sell the ship to a man named Matthew Isaac Smith, who lives in Liverpool. And then he owns the ship very briefly, and he ends up selling the ship to Majid bin Said, who's the Sultan of Zanzibar. And Zanzibar is going to use Shenandoah as a warship for Zanzibar's navy
Hmm.
off the east coast of Africa. They rename the ship El Majidi, and it becomes part of the Sultan's fleet. And it spends the next several years going between Zanzibar and then sailing east to Bombay in India, and back and forth, transporting people, transporting supplies, transporting soldiers, and then just patrolling the coast of Zanzibar. But it doesn't have a very good string of luck doing any of that. It's wrecked in a hurricane in 1872 off the coast of Zanzibar, sinks, they refloat it, they repair it, and then in 1872 in September, as it's going to Bombay, the wreck, the parts of the ship that were weakened from the hurricane open up. The ship starts flooding. It sinks again. They raise it again. They repair it again, and then it sinks a third time in the Gulf of Aden. That's in 1879. Um, while on its way to Bombay again. So like the ship sinks three times in its post Civil War career, which is kind of interesting
Hmm.
uh, to me, just because of the monsoon seasons and the hurricanes and the typhoons and just the weather of the Indian Ocean being a little unpredictable. The crew, however, that's a big different story. Most of the crew, British subjects, they're released on their own, and many of them just sign on to other merchant ships in the area, or they go back to London because that's where they originally signed on to the ship in the first place. And so lots of the British subjects, they end up just going home or just continuing on in this maritime seafaring thing. The officers, though, it's a completely different story. The Civil War is over, and lots of Confederates are receiving amnesty. Andrew Johnson declared this amnesty policy that former Confederates, they're not going to be put on trial. They get to go home. But there are exceptions to that amnesty. If you're a Confederate general or if you were in the Confederate government, those are things that are exempting you. One of the 13 things that will prevent you from getting amnesty from Andrew Johnson is if you served as an officer on these commerce raiders. And so all of these officers, if they go back to the United States, they could be put on trial and they could end up in jail. And they know this. And they know that this is a possibility because in December 1865, Raphael Semmes, the skipper of Alabama, is arrested so they could put him on trial. And he's ultimately not put on trial, but he's in jail for being a Confederate commerce raiding captain. And so what happens is the officers, they don't go back to the United States, or at least at first they don't. So Waddell, he stays in Europe until 1875. And it's only after a more blanket amnesty policy is made at the end of Reconstruction that he goes back to the United States. And he doesn't even go back to the South. He ends up captaining ships of the Pacific Mail Steamship Company in California. So he ends up in charge of some of the ships that he would have liked to capture during the Civil War, which I think is kind of ironic.
Yeah.
One of the junior officers, Irvin Bullock, he stays in England for the rest of his life. He's actually the half brother, I think it is, of James Bullock. And both of them just live in Liverpool and they stay in England and they set up a law practice and businesses and stuff like that. And they just stay in England for the remainder of their life in exile. They don't return to the United States. Other officers, they move to Argentina. There's 4 of them: Sidney Smith Lee, Oris Brown, John Mason, and William Whittle, the ship's executive officer. They all move to Rosario, Argentina. They set up a farm and a cattle ranch there. And they're going to stay there for years. And it's interesting because I've read some of the correspondence. They are sending notes to the U.S. government saying, hey, can we get a special pardon from the president so we can come home? And I'm seeing the replies from the U.S. government, and the replies are, you will not get a pardon. You are not coming home. You're not doing it. And it's not until a more blanket amnesty is made and pardons are eventually granted years later that they return home. So they're also in some sort of exile in South America. And it sort of represents this huge shift of Confederates post-war, Confederate naval officers. Enclaves of them are found in Halifax, Nova Scotia, in Liverpool, and South America in different parts, largely because they're all worried about being put on trial for this commerce raiding, for being accused of piracy, essentially. It's pretty weird.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I didn't know any of this. So cool. Okay, so how does the Shenandoah voyages influence international maritime law and neutrality rules in the future?
Yeah, so Shenandoah and the other Confederate commerce raiders, they are used as an example after the war. After the Civil War, the U.S. government wants restitution, and they want restitution. They can't get it from the Confederacy. That government doesn't exist anymore. And so they start suing England, essentially. They start suing the United Kingdom, and they're demanding payment in money, reparations, for the British government outfitting these Confederate commerce raiders. Alabama, Florida, Shenandoah, Rappahannock, they were all acquired in England. They were all British built. The Laird rams, ironclads built for the Confederacy in England. I mean, they ended up in the Royal Navy, but essentially, the U.S. government sues the United Kingdom saying, you guys didn't even keep your own neutrality during the war. You declared neutrality, Queen Victoria, and you didn't follow it. And so they're going to ask for damages in that. And that becomes known as the Alabama claims cases, where documents are collected, testimony is collected. That one cook that I was talking about, John Williams, the black cook who were deserted from Shenandoah, his testimony is used in the Alabama claims arbitration to determine that, they were violating British laws and that they were acting in an illegal fashion in some respects. This Alabama claims is essentially, it becomes part of a larger collection of talks that are held in Geneva. And those talks become collectively what results in this thing known as the Treaty of Washington, which is done in the 1870s. The United States of America is going to be awarded $15.5 million in damages because of these Alabama claims. But this Treaty of Washington, these talks in Geneva, though, it's much bigger than that. That Treaty of Washington is also something that helps Canada become a more independent dominion instead of a more directly governed colony. And this Treaty of Washington becomes the standard because multiple countries were involved in the negotiations. The British were, Italy, Switzerland, Brazil, and the United States were all involved. So neutral countries were involved. And essentially the agreements that they made formed the baseline of what became the Hague Convention of International Diplomacy. So the Civil War has a huge ramification for international maritime law and for international law as a whole. It's just that those talks didn't occur during the war. They happened afterwards because of the war itself, because of these actions. So it's kind of pretty interesting.
Yeah, this is, yeah. And in terms of global naval history, where does the Shenandoah sit and how is it remembered, in history?
Yeah. So, like I said, Shenandoah is the second most successful in terms of just number of ships captured. Shenandoah is the second most successful Confederate commerce raider with 38 captures. That's huge on its own, and that leads to a large element of why it's got a huge element of memory. So, uh, the two commerce raiders that everybody remembers and when they study the Civil War are Alabama and Shenandoah. Alabama because it was the most successful and because of Raphael Semmes and because of it going down at in Cherbourg, battling USS Kearsarge. It's kind of got that romanticized thing. Shenandoah is also highly romanticized in its remembrances. And that's because it circumnavigated the globe. It surrendered last. The crew didn't even know the war was over. And so all of this leads to this romantic view. Shenandoah is highly remembered because the captain of the ship wrote his own memoirs, and the executive officer of the ship kept his own diary, and both of them have been published. And so there's this huge collection of books about Shenandoah. The logbook of Shenandoah has actually been preserved. It's on display in North Carolina, and it's been digitized, so you can just go online and search CSS Shenandoah logbook, and in 5 seconds you can be reading the handwritten logbook of that ship. So it's still around, and that's pretty rare. And then a whole bunch of secondary sources, secondary books written by historians like me, have been written about Shenandoah, and that's kind of another reason why it has been brought to the forefront. So in the last 30 years, a book about Shenandoah has been written in 1995, another one in 2005, two in 2006, one in 2008, two in 2015, and two in 2018. The two that I like, we've got Dwight Hughes's A Confederate Biography, so he's another emerging Civil War guy like me. And then Tom Chaffin's Sea of Grey is sort of my favorite one, just because I like the way that he wrote the story and I like the way that he articulated things. Chaffin's book is one of the ones that came out in 2006. But my point is, in the last 30 years, there have been how many books written about this ship? And there's a reason for that. It's because it's got records that people can access. It's got documentation in these post-war claims that people can access. And it's got this romanticized view of just being that cool ship that was out there killing whaling boats and blowing things up, even when the war was over. And that's just a really neat thing. It draws people in. So it just keeps getting looked at in different lights. And that's kind of a cool thing. So it's definitely more famous than some of the other Confederate warships. I would say this is one of the top 5 most famous Confederate warships during the conflict.
Definitely. And Hollywood, Netflix, if you're listening, please make us a TV series, but try and get it accurate as you can for entertainment purposes. Obviously, they can't always do that. But yeah, no, fantastic, Neil. Thank you. I just want to point everything out to something out to everyone. So there is plaques in Liverpool
Mhm.
where the surrender sort of took place. Now, a few of these people in this photograph I actually know personally as well. They're in my reenacting group. One of them being my major. I don't know why he decided to be a Confederate a naval person at that point, but he is the Union commander now, Greg, a wonderful guy. So I just wanted to point that out to people that visit Liverpool. Go and have a look at these amazing signs that are there that were placed in 2015, I believe. And also, there was a Confederate consul in Liverpool, which is still there. You can go and visit that. And I think the Laird shipyards are still in operation to this day, I believe.
Yeah, they have a different name now because the company's been bought and then rebought and then rebought. But the Laird shipyard is still in Birkenhead. It's still making ships today.
It certainly is. And so, yeah, I just wanted to point that out. So that's the Shenandoah. Thank you, Neil. But let's talk about you because you have three books, don't you? Your latest one is The Treasure Empire in the Civil War, isn't it? But just
Yeah.
tell us about your books, mate.
Yeah. So my first book is the one in the middle there, Fought Like Devils. It's just essentially a ship study. Think of it as like a regimental history, but for one warship. That thing started out as a research paper during my undergraduate coursework at university. It's pretty neat, I guess. It's I would definitely write it differently today, but that was my first attempt at writing something cool. Defending the Arteries of Rebellion, it's an examination of the Confederacy's ambitions to build a naval force on the Mississippi River Valley, how it worked, how it fell apart, and then essentially everybody always talks about how the United States won control of the Mississippi River. This is talking about how the Confederates lost control of the Mississippi River in some respects. And then Treasure and Empire in the Civil War is this massive look at how the Confederate Navy tried to intercept the gold and the mineral wealth of the United States and also the Confederate Army, and then how the United States government tried to protect the mineral wealth of North America through defending California, through defending the Western territories, and then through safeguarding the shipping lanes between California, the Caribbean Sea, and the East Coast of the United States. So that one's kind of a hybrid of military, naval, economic, and diplomatic stuff, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah, it definitely is. And I will make sure there are links in the podcast description, ladies and gentlemen. So if you would like to get hold of a copy of one of Neil's books, please, there will be a link there for you guys. I just want to ask Neil, is there an Emerging Civil War series book coming about the Confederate Navy?
Yeah, so I've got two more books in the works right now. One book is it's a and it's going to be the first book ever written about the Battle of the Head of Passes, which is a battle in 1861 at the mouth of the Mississippi River. That one's supposed to be like a late 2026 thing. And then I've got another book that's coming out for the Emerging Civil War series that's supposed to be in early mid 2026. That one, its working title is This Great Contest Afloat. And it's supposed to be an examination of the four major naval theaters of the Civil War. So the blockade, the littoral zone, the coastline areas, the riverine aspects, and then the commerce raiding, open ocean aspects. And think of that one as sort of a introductory primer for what does naval activity in the Civil War look like? How is it organized? And what are people doing in each of these four major aspects of the war to contribute to the war effort, so to speak?
Oh, brilliant. I look forward to that. Okay, let's just talk again about Emergency War because you are manager, you're the editor. I can't remember what your title is. Sorry, you have to.
I'm like 25 things for that. Yeah.
Yeah, you are.
I'm
Yeah,
so for Emerging Civil War, I'm the organization's vice president. I'm
that's the one. Yeah.
the official managing editor, and I'm also the editorial board chair, who oversees all the guest writing. So when people want to write for us that aren't members, I'm oversee the team that evaluates their work and stuff like that. So yeah, so Emerging Civil War, we're a nonprofit organization dedicated to two things. One is making access to information about the Civil War era more accessible to a general audience, and the other is to help train and mentor the next generation of emerging voices in Civil War scholarship. And so we're always looking to promote young, new voices in the field however we can, and then get new information out there to a bigger audience however we can. So we do that through our website, we do that through our book series, our symposium, and through however else we can, like talks like this. So it's
Yeah.
great stuff.
Excellent. And Neil, I don't think I've heard your story of how you got involved with emergency war. How did that go down?
Um, by happenstance. So I was just doing some internet searches and I found the website, and way back in like 2016 or 2017, I like started making a couple of comments on a couple of posts, and then I realized, wait, I could write for these guys if I wanted to. I wrote a few articles for them about some random stuff. In fact, the second thing that I ever wrote for them was a summary, like a very brief summary of what eventually turned into that Treasure and Empire in the Civil War book. Um, and after a while, they were like, "Hey, do you just want to be in the organization as a historian?" And I said yes. And that was around 2020-ish. And I've been doing it ever since. So it's pretty good stuff.
It is pretty cool, and yeah, it's a great organisation to be involved with, as we both know. But yeah, no, all that is left to say, Neil, is thank you so much for getting up super early in the morning, which you do anyway, because of your naval experience in the past. Like you
Sure.
said, you're very regimental with timings and that, so that's fantastic. And all that is left to say, my friend, is cheers.
Absolutely. Cheers. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.